Previously, on the last days of World War II, the Red Army launched a brutal and massive assault on Berlin as Nuremberg, the spiritual home of the Nazi Party, fell to US forces. In Berlin, Hitler paused to celebrate his 56th birthday as Soviet artillery bombardments reverberate in the distance. In the Pacific, US troops capture a vital peninsula on Okinawa. Offshore, Allied warships continue to be terrorized by deadly waves of kamikazes. This week, terrified and exhausted Berliners are bracing themselves for the arrival of the Red Army. Benito Mussolini and his mistress are captured in northern Italy and suffer a humiliating and brutal demise. In the Pacific, the battle for Okinawa intensifies. The Japanese fight on desperately as their positions are rocked by the overwhelming firepower of the Americans. The 23rd of April, Germany. In a small forest village near Floss, about 250 miles south of Berlin, troops from the US 2nd Cavalry liberate the Flossenburg concentration camp. Established in 1938, it was the fourth Nazi camp to be set up in Germany. Flossenburg was considered a hard regime camp. Most prisoners worked in stone quarries. Here, malnutrition, lack of proper medical care, and abuse at the hands of savage SS guards caused the death of an estimated 73,000 prisoners. At one point, Flossenburg had held up to 18,000 prisoners. Now, only about 2,000 remain. Those who do manage to survive are weak, and many are dying. 3 days before, the SS had forced more than 14,000 prisoners on a death march. About 4,000 of those prisoners died of exhaustion or starvation, or were shot by the SS. Such notorious marches were first heard of 2 weeks before, when retreating German soldiers had moved more than 43,000 Jewish prisoners out of the notorious Buchenwald concentration camp, days before it was liberated by US troops.
These death marches took place all over Germany, and certainly from the camps in Poland. And the idea was simple. They can't gas us because they had to destroy the gas chambers. This was the next phase of extinction. We were walking endlessly, dressed in rags and no shoes. The assumption was we would just drop dead.
Even now, despite the imminent collapse of the Third Reich, thousands more will die as a result of forced marches. The 26th of April. As American forces approach from the west, there are more than 67,000 prisoners in the Dachau concentration camp and its subcamps. SS soldiers force about 7,000 prisoners from Dachau on a death march. SS guards shoot anyone who cannot keep going during the 6-day ordeal. Other prisoners die of exposure, hunger, or exhaustion. Survivors of the death march would eventually be liberated at Tegernsee on the 2nd of May. Over the last months of the war in Europe, an estimated 250,000 concentration camp prisoners died on these forced marches. The 27th of April. Troops from the US 103rd Division liberate the Bavarian town of Landsberg, home to one of the Dachau subcamps. The town's fortress once served as a political prison. It was here that Adolf Hitler had written Mein Kampf whilst imprisoned for attempting a Nazi coup d'etat in 1924. In the neighbouring town of Kaufering, the Allies uncover evidence of a massacre, which shocks even the most battle-hardened GIs. US soldiers find a concentration camp and the charred remains of 268 prisoners who had been locked in rooms and burned alive. Outraged GIs load the local townspeople into trucks and take them to see the crimes committed in their name.
Many Allied soldiers, both British and American, were utterly bewildered by the stony faces with which most Germans who were forced to go and look at neighbouring death camps responded. That some burst into tears, but most of them appeared to show no emotion at all, that they'd almost given up on emotion of any kind.
None of the civilians admit any knowledge of the camp. They say the Nazis had told them it was a secret war factory, so they didn't ask questions. But Nazi atrocities will not go unpunished. The day of reckoning is fast approaching. On the outskirts of Berlin, the overwhelming assault of the Red Army is wreaking havoc. General Zhukov and General Konyev's armies have the city nearly surrounded. It's only a matter of time before they strike the fatal blow to the shattered German capital. The 22nd of April, Berlin. Life inside the city has been reduced to utter chaos. Berlin comes under a relentless artillery bombardment. For nearly 2 years, the Royal Air Force has mounted devastating raids on the German capital. High explosives and incendiaries have burned out large tracts of the city. Even the Tiergarten, which houses the city's famous zoo, has been hit. Some animals have been evacuated, but those left behind are now dead. Streets are littered with corpses and rubble. The city is wreathed in smoke, ash, and death. Despite the rapidly deteriorating conditions, roughly 3 million people remain in the city. Many have taken to living in the air raid shelters, most of which are desperately overcrowded. Everyone is terrified at the prospect of being overrun by an unforgiving Red Army. The anxiety among German women is especially high. They fear the abuse they will suffer at the hands of the invading enemy.
They were intent on rape, pillage, and revenge, and that's exactly what they did. Everywhere they went, they took what they wanted, literally. So the great concern, the great panic throughout Germany in this period was how the hell do you get away from the Russians?
Not knowing that Berlin is a prize that has been awarded to the Soviets, residents of Berlin still hope that the Western Allies will take the German capital first. Many of the city's inhabitants morbidly joke that the optimists are learning to speak English, the pessimists Russian.
It is absolutely clear that Germany will be defeated. It's absolutely clear that there is no way out, and the people who died there basically died in vain.
But Hitler, isolated in his underground bunker, grows only more delusional. He frantically clings to the hope that his weary, outnumbered, and outgunned army can withstand the invaders long enough for some miracle to rescue the situation. Many in the Führer's inner circle do not share his delusions. Acutely aware that the end is near, 11th-hour negotiations are taking place. Evidence is being destroyed, and bags are being packed.
Within the Führer bunker itself, a kind of surreal air dominated, and many people seemed to be living the dream that Hitler was living at that time. Others of his henchmen, and especially Goering and Himmler, begin to pursue their own paths.
Some of them were not in as great a denial as Hitler and were making plans to basically slip out of the country or find their defense when the ensuing war crimes trials came up. Many of them were looking after number one rather than the Führer.
Hitler's authority over the thinning ranks of loyal Nazis is eroding as the massive Soviet army storms through the heart of the Reich. Berlin is now the Red Army's priority. The 23rd of April, Berlin, Hitler receives a telegram from Hermann Göring, founder of the Gestapo, commander-in-chief of the Luftwaffe, and president of the Reichstag. The telegram's message drives him into an incandescent rage. It reads, "My Führer, in view of your decision to remain at your post in the fortress of Berlin, do you agree that I take over, at once, the total leadership of the Reich, with full freedom of action at home and abroad, as your deputy? If no reply is received by 10 o'clock tonight, I shall take it for granted that you have lost your freedom of action and shall act for the best interests of our country and our people." Hitler is blind with fury and orders Göring's arrest. In a matter of days, Hitler would order the arrest of another high-ranking Nazi, one of his most loyal henchmen, the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler. The 24th of April, the Baltic coast. Count Bernadotte, vice president of the Swedish Red Cross and a nephew of the King of Sweden, passes a top-secret message from Heinrich Himmler to the Western Allies. Himmler had secretly met with Bernadotte the night before at the Swedish consulate, in hopes that he could help negotiate Germany's surrender to the Western Allies. It was not their first meeting. Unbeknownst to Hitler, the two had convened once before in Berlin back in February. Himmler had attempted to win asylum for himself and 200 leading Nazis by offering cash and the freedom of 3,500 Jews. In 3 days, the message will be passed to Himmler, once and for all, that the Allies will not consider a conditional surrender. Hitler learns of Himmler's plot after the first trainload of Jews bound for Switzerland sets off. Hitler halts the plans immediately, but Himmler, far from Berlin, slips away and escapes the Führer's vengeance. Hitler's 1,000-year Reich is collapsing like a house of cards. The 28th of April, Berlin. Suspecting that Waffen-SS General Hermann Fegelein may have been involved with Himmler's attempt to surrender to the Western Allies, Hitler has Fegelein arrested. Fegelein, a former Olympic show jumper, rose through the ranks as an SS cavalry officer and had married Gretel Braun, the sister of Eva, Hitler's mistress. When he is arrested, he is found with money, jewels, and a false passport. Fegelein is interrogated by Gestapo chief Heinrich Müller himself. But there is no question what his fate will be. The following morning, he is dragged out into the Reich Chancellery garden and shot. As senior officers and officials plot their escape, the remnants of Hitler's armed forces in Berlin desperately try to hold out against the Red Army. Hitler now places the fate of Germany in the hands of 2 of his remaining generals. SS General Felix Steiner, commander of the 11th SS Panzer Army stationed just north of Berlin, has been ordered to link up with General von Manteuffel's 3rd Army and launch a counterattack. But Steiner declares it to be an impossible order. Hitler is not deterred. His hopes turn to Field Marshal Schörner of Army Group Center and General Walter Wenck, commander of the 12th Army. Hitler believes their troops will be able to fend off US forces advancing from the southwest. He anticipates news of reinforcements from Wenck, but that relief would never come. The Red Army now has Berlin effectively surrounded, preventing 200,000 Germans to the southeast from reinforcing the city's ragtag defense. The only troops left to defend the German capital are the remnants of Wehrmacht units, Hitler Youth, First World War veterans, and men of the fearsome Waffen-SS. The first SS units had been formed in 1923 to serve as Hitler's personal guard. 5 years later, the SS had a strength of 280 under the command of Heinrich Himmler. The SS would become a complex political and military organization with many branches, one of which was the Waffen-SS. Under Himmler's direction, it would grow exponentially into an elite military formation of nearly 600,000 men. the Waffen-SS would earn a reputation as one of the most ruthless fighting formations of the war. In one notorious incident, on the 10th of June 1944, more than 600 people in the French village of Oradour-sur-Glane were massacred by soldiers of an SS Panzer division. But by the spring of 1945, their glory and ranks had been depleted. The defense of Berlin will be made by just 95,000 men under the command of General Weidling. Only 60 tanks are available to support them. Outnumbered and outgunned, with nowhere left to run, Hitler must have dreamed of being able to recover his divisions trapped in Italy. Now they too stare defeat in the face. The 22nd of April, Italy. German forces, under the command of General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, are in full retreat. Von Vietinghoff knows the situation is hopeless. He calls a meeting of his senior officers at Recaro Terme and the foothills of the Alps. Among those in attendance is General Karl Wolff, head of the SS in Italy. 7 weeks ago, Wolff had opened secret negotiations with Alan Dulles, head of the OSS, predecessor to the CIA. Against Hitler's orders, Wolff had offered to surrender German forces in Western Italy. He hoped that the Western Allies would sign a separate peace, leaving German forces free to try to save their country from the Soviets. In order to establish his credibility, Wolff had even arranged the release of a captured OSS agent. But after 2 months of negotiations, it becomes clear to Wolff that nothing short of a complete and unconditional surrender is acceptable. As Vietinghoff holds his meeting, the US 5th and the British 8th Armies are advancing. In 24 hours, they will cross the Po River and seize the town of Ferrara. The town of La Spezia on the west coast will be liberated on the same day. The retreating German troops can do little to stop them. Mussolini, living under German protection, will soon have to make new arrangements. The 25th of April, the towns of Mantua, Parma and Verona are liberated. It is clear that Milan, Il Duce's safe haven, is next, forcing Italy's former dictator to go on the run. He and his mistress, Claretta Petacci, flee the city and head for Lake Como. Alessandro Pavellini, one of Mussolini's most trusted supporters, promises to join him with 3,000 loyal fascists. Mussolini reaches Menaggio. There, Pavellini finally catches up with him. But instead of being backed by thousands of supporters, Pavellini has only a dozen men. Angry and frustrated, Mussolini has no choice but to join a German convoy heading for the Swiss border. The 26th of April, 6:30 a.m. Italian partisans spot the convoy and order it to stop. The Germans are allowed to continue, but Mussolini and Claretta are arrested. The 28th of April, Italy. The Wehrmacht is collapsing. Allied troops heading north encounter dejected German soldiers waving white flags on the roadsides. Walter Audicio, an Italian communist partisan, arrives at the farmhouse where Benito Mussolini and his mistress Claretta await their fate. The events that follow have long been disputed. In one version of events, Audicio drives the couple a few hundred yards down the road. Then, at the roadside, Mussolini and Claretta are cut down by a burst of machine gun fire.
He'd made Italy world famous, he had conquered Ethiopia, he had made peace with the church. And I genuinely think that if he hadn't gone to war with Hitler in 1940, which he didn't really have to do, Franco didn't, he'd have died in bed. And that very, very famous scene where the crowd is throwing things at the upside-down body of Mussolini was, of course, symbolic of the end of the regime.
The 24th of April. The Red Army is now roughly 5 miles from the Reich Chancellery. Under the command of Marshal Konev, the 1st Ukrainian Front smashes its way into the southern suburbs of the German capital. From the east, Marshal Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front has entered the city's eastern suburbs. Units from both armies are also moving north of the city to complete the encirclement. Leading the way into Berlin is one of the most powerful armored vehicles of the Second World War, the JS-2. Named after the Russian leader, Joseph Stalin, the JS-2 is also referred to as the Victory Tank. The 46-ton tank went into production at the end of October 1943 and entered service with heavy tank regiments the following year.
It scared everybody on the battlefield. It scared the Germans, but it certainly scared us too. It was their heavy tank. The idea being was this thing, could absorb a lot of punishment, but also dish it out.
It was designed to replace the KV line of heavy tanks, which by 1943 were thought to be seriously undergunned. The first JS tank, the JS-1, was fitted with an 85mm artillery weapon. This was quickly upgraded to the JS-2, equipped with a 122mm gun.
It had a huge gun, a 122mm gun, that had a massive muzzle brake on the end of the gun.
The shells from this gun could knock out a German Panther tank at a range of nearly 1 mile. Combined with its speed and maneuverability, as well as a 7.62mm machine gun, the 4-man JS-2 would become a formidable battlefield weapon, able to take on the latest German armor on equal terms. The 28th of April, Berlin. The Red Army is now just 1 mile from the Reich Chancellery and Hitler's underground bunker. In what has become a painstaking and devastating advance through the streets of Berlin, the Soviets now control 75% of the city.
The Russians find themselves having to fight block by block and street by street to try and get their tanks past all the obstacles created by these huge mounds of rubble and, of course, fires in all directions, smoke in every direction, that every Russian who was there described it as looking like an inferno.
General Weidling, commander of the Berlin garrison, tells Hitler that his men will run out of ammunition in 48 hours. Hitler is also informed that Berlin's Tempelhof airport has been taken by the Soviets. The last avenue of escape is now closed.
On the 28th of April, it was impossible to be in the bunker without feeling the concussion from the shells as the Russians were moving now street by street, closer and closer. There was still a briefing in the afternoon in which the word came that probably it would be 24 hours and the Russians would be there.
The roar of Soviet artillery and the rumble of tanks intensify with every hour that passes. As the battle for Berlin rages on, Hitler finally realizes the end is upon him.
It was only right at the end that he finally accepted that it was all over.
Stalin's forces are also pushing past the city, deeper into Germany. About 50 miles to the west, a clear signal arrives that final victory is at hand. The 24th of April, East finally meets West. Near the Mulda River, Albert Kotzebue, a 21-year-old lieutenant with the US 69th Division, leads a patrol that would make contact with the Soviet troops near the village of Kuren. Preparing for their patrol, the men are warned not to go beyond the limits of the village. The patrol arrives in Kuren and immediately rounds up 355 German soldiers eager to surrender to American forces. Lieutenant Kotzebue decides to set up camp for the night. Colonel Charles Adams radios an order for the men to return to base, but Kotzebue ignores the call. The 25th of April. The next day, moving east into the town of Lechwitz, Lieutenant Kotzebue and his men meet a lone horseman from the Russian army, who tells the Allies where they can find his fellow troops. The men speed off in their Willys jeeps in the hope of meeting Russian troops. The Willis Overland Company started manufacturing their Jeep for the US military in 1941. One of the most ubiquitous vehicles of World War II, the Jeep answered the Army's need for a lightweight, general-purpose vehicle that could be used in all theatres of operation. It served a distinct purpose, but how the Jeep got its name is not as clear. One story is that the vehicle got its name from the letters GP, short for General Purpose, which over time became Jeep. Another story is that Jeep is an old US Army term used by mechanics to refer to any new vehicle received for testing. And finally, in March 1936, the character Eugene the Jeep was introduced in the already beloved Popeye comic by E.C. Sagar. The military relied heavily on the Jeep because it was durable and almost unstoppable.
I mean, this thing could do anything. It was a four-wheel drive vehicle. It could go anywhere. It could do anything. Troops loved the thing. In fact, General Eisenhower said this was one of the weapons that won World War II for us.
The lightweight Jeep could do 60 miles an hour and cross the most difficult terrain with a 600-pound load.
It could tow a 37-millimeter anti-tank gun. It could tow a 57-millimeter anti-tank gun. It could carry 4 troops. This thing is everywhere.
Because of its compact size, airborne troops could load it onto a glider and drop it where it was needed. Not only was it fast on rugged terrain, it had a small turning radius, could climb a 40-degree slope and lean 50 degrees without rolling. Once fitted with a special air intake and exhaust attachments, the Jeep could even run in deep water. At the height of production, one Jeep rolled off the assembly line every 90 seconds. The 25th of April, 12:30 p.m. Driving east, Lieutenant Kotzebue and his men crossed the Elbe River in a commandeered boat. When they reached the far bank, they are greeted by men from the Soviet 58th Guards Infantry Division. Kotzebue immediately sends word to Colonel Adams that contact has been made with the Soviets. However, this historic moment will be eclipsed. Having not received word from Kotzebue, Colonel Adams had dispatched 2 patrols to find him. One is under the command of Lieutenant William Robertson. At 4 p.m., Robertson's patrol enters the town of Torgau, west of the Elbe. In Torgau, Robertson and his men encounter Soviet troops from the 173rd Rifle Regiment. A meeting of high-ranking officers is arranged for the next day. The 26th of April. In a momentous occasion, US General Reinhardt and Soviet General Vladimir Rusakov meet and pose for photographs.
It was basically a highly symbolic moment, of course, because that meant that it was only a matter of days or weeks that the German Reich would be finished.
Everyone realizes that victory can be only days away. But the scenes are ironic, given the suspicion that will dominate Soviet-American relations for years to come.
They drank each other's booze, they smoked each other's cigarettes, they exchanged caps, and, well, then they realized that there were a lot of great differences between them. You could say that the Second World War ends and the Cold War begins around the same time.
The 22nd of April, Okinawa. Fighting on the island reaches its most intense phase. US troops have been on the island for 3 weeks and are inching south into the barrier that lies between them and the island's capital, Naha. The previous week, Japanese forces on the Motobu Peninsula were eliminated, ending major ground operations in the north. It has been a painstaking and brutal trudge for the soldiers, engaged in some of the most ferocious combat of the war. More than any tank, plane, or piece of artillery, it is the American GI that the Allied commanders are now relying upon. In 1941, the population of the United States stood at just over 133 million. During World War II, over 16 million would serve in the military. They came from all walks of life, all ethnic and economic backgrounds. 45% had at least a high school education. Although the average age of a GI was 26, many were barely 18. Some who had lied about their age to enlist were even younger. Infantrymen were shipped out after just 8 weeks of basic training. They faced some of the most brutal combat conditions the world has ever known.
If you're not in good shape, forget it. You don't have a chance. But you have to be trained mentally as well.
American GIs were highly motivated, many inspired by a patriotic sense of duty. In the field, troops often lived off K rations, packs containing 2,700 calories, designed to last 2 or 3 days. Sometimes they had to be made to last much longer. The servicemen also make do with a 1-quart canteen of water.
Well, you have a canteen full of water and you got to wash your socks, brush your teeth, make coffee, and see whatever else you can do without water to make it last. These are the discomforts and sacrifices that you understood and you live with.
No piece of equipment made the American GI so recognizable as his helmet, that not only protected a soldier's head against enemy fire and shrapnel, but served as a wash basin, a shovel, and even as a weapon in extreme circumstances. As life in foxholes and trenches took its toll, the infantry relied on each other for survival.
You stay as tight as you can, as close as you can to the small unit who are your buddies, your brothers. The cliches are true. Band of brothers. These are the guys you're fighting for that are going to watch your back and keep you alive, and you're going to fight for them.
I was really worried that my turn was next. We had a priest, the battalion chaplain, and I ran into him, and I said, "Father Lacey, I'm really scared. I'm going to get killed." He said, "Son, we're all scared." The next day, we're in a defensive position, and I turn around, and there's Father Lacey crawling up to my foxhole. He said, "Oh, I was just in the neighborhood. I thought I'd drop by." The truth is, what he was doing was supporting me, and I never forgot that.
In 2000, Time magazine readers voted the American GI amongst their top 20 most influential people of the century. But many veterans have never spoken of the horrors they faced.
I didn't want to talk about it because it would have been disrespecting the dead. I'm not going to talk about anything I did because there were several guys I was best buddies with that were 2 inches from me and got it between the eyes, and I didn't. And that's got nothing to do with courage. It's got nothing to do with how good a soldier you are.
Those that do speak, do so with humility.
Heroes. Heroes are the guys that didn't make it. And heroes are guys that are wounded. Not me.
Heck no. Did 2 things. Tried to stay alive and try to do my job, that was all. No, I'm not a hero. No. But I served with men who got the job done, who were heroes.
This week, American infantry on Okinawa must now turn their attention to the series of natural defenses protecting the Japanese army. The Machinato Line, the first line of defense in the formidable Shuri Line, is a craggy outcropping which US forces have already begun to infiltrate. The main Shuri Line itself is home to the bulk of Japanese forces on Okinawa. Although the danger is not always evident, US troops are aware that the enemy is well hidden in the mountains that surround them. It is here that the main battle for Okinawa will be fought, and where American forces will meet their toughest resistance yet. The 22nd of April, Okinawa. As US troops plan their next attack, the front line appears quiet. It's a much-needed reprieve for US troops to reorganize and resupply. Reinforcements arrive. The 27th Division is landed to bolster the 2 divisions of the 10th Army already in position. The 23rd of April. During the night, the Japanese lay down a heavy artillery barrage in the mountains. The next morning, American forces discover that the Japanese have abandoned their forward positions. Having accepted the inevitable capture of the forward line, Ushijima orders his men to pull back to stronger positions. It is the kind of astute tactical maneuver that is characteristic of General Ushijima.
The movement further south by the Japanese troops, I think, was sparked by a realization that the Americans had finally figured out the combination of techniques that would work to dislodge troops from the Shuri line.
Ushijima redeploys Japanese soldiers from other areas in the south to help fortify the line. The 26th of April, US forces immediately attack the second ring of defenses. The big guns of the battleships Mississippi and Colorado lend their weight to the bombardment on Japanese positions. But along the line, the Japanese are dug in deep and out of sight. The 28th of April, 2 p.m. More than 200 aircraft attack the Allied fleet in 44 separate assaults, which last into the night. 118 Japanese aircraft are lost to anti-aircraft fire and US Navy Corsairs. Once again, the fleet escapes serious damage. The biggest casualties are aboard a hospital ship about 50 miles southeast of Okinawa. 23 on board are killed, including 6 Army nurses. The 27th Division is suffering heavy casualties, trying to shift the Japanese defenders from their second line of defense. In the center of the island, the 96th Division is faring slightly better, having taken the Nishibaru Ridge. But the Japanese continue to defend each position tenaciously.
A lot of credit has to be given to Ushijima and to the planning that went into this, so that they were able to use pre-planned routes of escape, use pre-planned routes of withdrawal, some of it under cover of darkness, so that it's not that easy for the Americans to understand exactly what's happening and who's moving.
The only time we saw the enemy was the remains of their bodies as we passed over them, moving across an area, because the area had been wiped out.
US forces are using everything in their arsenal to dislodge Japanese positions in the mountains: artillery, tanks, and flamethrowers. The Japanese are awed by the scale of American firepower and their abundant supplies of ammunition. For the Japanese, trapped on the southern isthmus of Okinawa, the situation can only get worse. Supplies are already running low.
The Japanese people are feeling the pinch. They have less food to eat, and they're getting more and more desperate.
They're essentially stuck with whatever is on the island at that point and have to make that last for as long as possible.
But the Imperial Army fights on with what is available. As casualties mount in the Pacific, top military and government officials calculate the likely butcher's bill from a ground invasion of mainland Japan. The 25th of April, Washington, D.C. President Truman receives his first full briefing on the Manhattan Project from Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Truman had only found out about the atomic bomb program 2 weeks ago, after being sworn in as president. Now he is given a fuller understanding of what is involved. The Secretary of War tells Truman, "Within 4 months, we shall, in all probability, have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history. One bomb of which could destroy a whole city."
When Stimson and others began to realize that the atomic bomb might be ready to be deployed in reasonably soon, they began trying to figure out how to use it. And there were lots of proposals, but I don't think they ever really considered anything but dropping it on a major city.
The 27th of April, the Pentagon. A committee meets to draw up a list of targets, for what will prove to be the most destructive weapon of the war.